The first time I realized something was wrong, I was the only one at the table who got sick. Chloe Bennet kept her smile frozen as she sat under the warm dining room lights, her stepmother Rebecca's voice floating sweetly across the table while her father Daniel laughed at something small and forgettable, and everything about the scene looked perfect from the outside, the kind of family dinner people would envy, except for the quiet knot tightening in Chloe's stomach that had nothing to do with nerves and everything to do with a pattern she could no longer ignore, because it was always like this, always after Rebecca insisted on cooking something just for her, always after that same gentle tone, that same careful attention that made everyone else believe Rebecca was kind and thoughtful, and Chloe had tried to convince herself it was coincidence, that maybe her body was adjusting to being back home after college, that maybe stress was catching up to her, but the timing was too precise, too consistent, and as she pushed her food around the plate, Rebecca noticed. Immediately, tilting her head with concern and asking softly if something was wrong, her eyes warm, almost too warm, and Chloe forced herself to take another bite just to avoid the attention, just to keep things normal, because every time she hesitated, Rebecca would insist more, would gently pressure her in front of Daniel until saying no felt impossible, and Daniel, who trusted Rebecca completely, would always side with her, telling Chloe she needed to eat properly and stop overthinking things, and that was the worst part, not the discomfort, not even the growing fear, but the way no one else saw it, the way Rebecca had built this perfect image that made Chloe's doubts sound irrational, and as the conversation continued and the laughter filled the room, Chloe felt that same slow wave rising again, subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, but familiar enough to make her grip the edge of the table just slightly tighter, her mind racing through every detail, every meal, every moment leading up to this, and for the first time, she stopped questioning herself and started asking a different question entirely, one that made her pulse quicken despite her calm expression, because if it was not an accident, if it was not stress, then it meant something far worse. Something she was not ready to say out loud yet, even to herself. Chloe did not excuse herself right away, because leaving too quickly would draw attention, and attention was the last thing she wanted when her thoughts were beginning to shift from confusion into something sharper and more dangerous, so she stayed at the table, nodding at the right moments, forcing small responses while the sensation in her stomach slowly intensified, and across from her Rebecca watched with that same gentle expression, occasionally asking if she wanted more, if she liked the seasoning, if everything tasted right, and every question sounded caring on the surface but felt strangely deliberate underneath, as if Rebecca was measuring something Chloe could not yet fully define, and when Chloe finally stood up, pressing a hand lightly against the table, she offered a quick apology about needing some air, and Daniel barely looked up, simply telling her not to skip dessert, while Rebecca's eyes followed her just a second longer than necessary, a quiet detail Chloe might have ignored before but could not ignore now, and once she stepped outside into the cool evening air, the contrast hit her immediately, the fresh breeze steadying her just enough to think clearly, and that was when the pattern became impossible to deny, because she could trace it back, not just to tonight, but to the past several weeks since she had moved back home, every dinner Rebecca prepared specifically for her, every moment Rebecca insisted on adding something extra to Chloe's plate. Every time Chloe felt fine before eating and unwell afterward, and it was too consistent, too controlled, and for the first time Chloe stopped asking herself if she was imagining it and started asking why, and that question led somewhere even more unsettling, because Rebecca had no reason to do this, at least none that made sense on the surface, which meant either Chloe was missing something important or Rebecca was hiding something much bigger, and as Chloe leaned against the porch railing, her breathing slowly evening out, she realized she could not confront anyone yet, not without proof, not when Daniel already trusted Rebecca completely, so instead she made a quiet decision, one that felt small but carried weight, because the next time Rebecca offered her food, Chloe would not refuse, she would not argue, she would simply watch more closely than ever before, and this time, she would not miss anything. The next evening, Chloe made sure she was already in the kitchen before dinner started, moving quietly, pretending to scroll through her phone while positioning herself just enough to see without being seen, and Rebecca was there as expected, humming softly while preparing the meal with the same calm precision she always showed, measuring, stirring, tasting, everything deliberate and controlled, and at first nothing seemed unusual, just routine movements that could belong to any careful home. cook, but Chloe did not let herself relax. She watched every detail, every pause, every moment where Rebecca's attention shifted, and then she noticed it, not something obvious, not something anyone else would question, but a subtle difference in how Rebecca handled one specific plate, Chloe's plate, the one she had already set aside on the counter, slightly separated from the others. And Rebecca reached for a small container Chloe had never paid attention to before, something plain, almost forgettable, and for a brief second Rebecca glanced over her shoulder, not in panic, but in quiet awareness, as if checking whether anyone was paying attention, and Chloe instinctively lowered her gaze, pretending not to look, her heart starting to beat faster even though nothing had actually happened yet, and when she looked again, Rebecca had already finished whatever she was doing, closing the container and sliding Chloe's plate back into line with the others as if there had never been a difference, and moments later, Rebecca turned with that same warm smile, asking Chloe if she was hungry, if she wanted to sit down early, her voice light and inviting, and Chloe forced herself to nod, to act normal, even as her thoughts sharpened into something colder, more focused, because now it was not just a feeling, not just a pattern, it was a moment, a small but undeniable break in the routine that only existed around her, and as they sat down at the table and the plates were passed around, Chloe kept her expression steady, her movements calm, but inside she was already adjusting her plan, because watching was no longer enough, she needed to know exactly what that container held, and more importantly, why it was only ever used for her. Chloe did not eat the food right away this time, even though Rebecca was watching her with that same gentle expectation. And Daniel was already halfway through his meal, unaware of the quiet tension building just inches away from him, so instead Chloe picked up her fork slowly, letting it hover for a moment as if she was simply distracted, and then she took a small bite, just enough to keep everything looking normal, just enough to avoid questions, but not enough to commit, and as the conversation moved around the table, she shifted her attention carefully, noting every detail, the taste, the texture, anything that felt even slightly different, and there was something faint and unfamiliar beneath the seasoning, something she could not immediately identify but could not ignore either, and her pulse quickened, not from fear this time, but from confirmation, because whatever Rebecca had added, it was real, it was intentional, and it was happening again, and while Daniel talked about work and weekend plans, Chloe quietly adjusted her strategy, moving her food around her plate, spacing out small bites while making it appear as though she was eating normally, and Rebecca noticed, of course she noticed, her eyes flickering toward Chloe's plate every few seconds, her smile tightening just slightly when Chloe slowed down, and then Rebecca leaned forward, her voice soft but insistent, asking if Chloe liked it, asking if something was wrong, and Chloe met her gaze calmly, offering a small nod, saying it tasted fine, because she understood now that any resistance would only draw more attention, and attention was exactly what she needed to avoid, at least for now, and as the dinner continued, Chloe felt the first subtle wave again, weaker this time, delayed, and that told her something important, that whatever effect Rebecca expected was tied to how much she consumed, which meant Chloe still had control, more control than Rebecca realized, and when the plates were finally cleared and Daniel stepped away to take a call, leaving the kitchen momentarily quiet, Chloe stood up. Slowly, carrying her dish to the sink, her movements steady, her expression neutral, and as she passed Rebecca, she let her voice remain casual, almost careless, as she thanked her for dinner, but inside her thoughts were already locking into place, because now she was certain of one thing, and certainty changed everything, because from this moment on, she was not just watching anymore, she was preparing to prove it. That night, Chloe did not go to bed right away, even though the house had gone quiet and Daniel had already turned off the lights downstairs, because her mind would not settle, every detail from dinner replaying with sharper clarity now that she was alone, and instead of lying there questioning herself like before, she moved carefully, slipping out of her room and walking down the hallway with slow, controlled steps, listening for any sound that might give her away, but the house remained still, and that gave her just enough confidence to continue, because this time she was not acting on suspicion alone, she was acting on something she had seen with her own eyes, and when she reached the kitchen, she did not turn on the main light, only the small one above the sink, keeping the room dim enough to avoid attention but bright enough to see what she needed, and her gaze went straight to the counter where Rebecca had stood earlier, scanning the space with quiet focus until she found it, the small container. Placed near the back as if it were nothing important, as if it did not matter at all, and Chloe approached it slowly, her fingers hovering for a second before she picked it up, feeling how light it was, how ordinary it seemed, and for a moment she hesitated, not out of fear, but out of realization, because opening it would mean crossing a line she could not uncross. It would mean accepting that this was not just in her head, that something deliberate was happening inside her own home, and yet she knew she could not stop now, not when everything pointed in the same direction, so she opened it carefully, her breath steady, her eyes narrowing as she looked inside, and what she saw was not dramatic, not obvious, just a fine, pale substance that could easily be mistaken for something harmless, something anyone might overlook without a second thought, and that was exactly what made it worse, because it meant this had been planned to blend in, to avoid suspicion, to remain unnoticed, and Chloe closed the container slowly, placing it back exactly where she found it, her movements precise, her expression calm, but inside something had shifted completely, because now she had more than a feeling, more than a pattern, she had proof that something was being added to her food, and the only question left, the one that settled heavily in her chest as she turned off the light and walked back toward her room, was not whether Rebecca was doing this, but why. The next morning, Chloe woke up earlier than usual, not because she had slept well, but because her mind refused to rest, every detail from the night before settling into something clearer, something more structured, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt focused, because now she had something real to work with, something she could build on, and as she stood in front of the mirror, brushing her hair with slow, steady movements, she reminded herself of one thing: she could not rush this. She could not confront Rebecca without understanding the full picture, because whatever Rebecca was doing, it was careful, controlled, and designed to go unnoticed, which meant Chloe needed to be just as careful in return, and when she walked downstairs, she found Rebecca already in the kitchen, moving through her usual routine with effortless calm, coffee brewing, breakfast half prepared, everything exactly as it always was, and that normalcy was almost unsettling now, because Chloe knew what was hidden beneath it, and Rebecca greeted her with the same warm smile, asking how she felt, her tone soft with concern, and Chloe answered just as calmly, saying she felt fine, because this time she meant it. She had not eaten enough the night before to trigger the same reaction, and that alone was another piece of confirmation, and as Daniel joined them, talking casually about the day ahead, Chloe watched Rebecca more closely than ever, not just her actions, but her timing, her attention, the way she moved around certain items in the kitchen, and Chloe noticed something else, something smaller but just as important. Rebecca never used that container when preparing food for herself or for Daniel, only when Chloe's plate was involved, and that detail settled heavily in Chloe's mind, because it removed any remaining doubt about intention, and as breakfast continued, Chloe made another quiet decision, one that felt riskier but necessary, because watching and noticing had brought her this far, but it would not be enough to prove anything to anyone else, especially not to Daniel, and if she wanted the truth to come out, she would need more than observation, she would need evidence that could not be dismissed. And as she finished her coffee and stood up from the table, Chloe kept her expression calm, her voice steady, but inside her thoughts were already shifting toward her next move, because now that she understood the pattern, now that she had seen the source, the only thing left was to catch Rebecca in a way she could not explain away. Chloe did not wait long to act, because waiting too long would give Rebecca time to adjust, to change whatever method she was using, and Chloe needed everything to stay exactly as it was, predictable and controlled, so that she could finally turn that control against her. And later that afternoon, when Rebecca stepped out to run errands and Daniel was still at work, Chloe moved quickly but carefully, setting her plan into motion, starting with the kitchen, where she retrieved the small container again, this time not to inspect it, but to replace its contents with something harmless, something that would not cause any reaction at all, and she worked with steady hands, making sure the texture looked the same, the amount unchanged, every detail preserved so that Rebecca would not notice any difference, and once it was done, Chloe placed it back exactly where it had been, aligning it perfectly with the surrounding items, because even the smallest shift could raise suspicion, and when she stepped back, she allowed herself a brief pause, not to question what she was doing, but to fully understand the moment, because this was no longer just about proving something to herself, this was about setting a trap, one that depended on Rebecca believing everything was still under her control. And that evening, when dinner began, Chloe returned to her seat with the same calm expression, the same quiet compliance she had shown before, and Rebecca, as expected, moved through her routine without hesitation, preparing the plates, separating Chloe's portion for that brief, subtle moment, reaching for the container without realizing anything had changed, and Chloe watched it all unfold with quiet precision, every movement confirming that Rebecca had no idea she was being observed on a deeper level now. And when the food was placed in front of her, Chloe did not hesitate this time. She ate normally, steadily, allowing Rebecca to see that nothing was different, allowing Daniel to remain completely unaware, and as the minutes passed, Chloe paid close attention to her body, waiting for the familiar wave, the subtle discomfort that always followed, but it did not come, not even slightly, and that absence spoke louder than anything else, because it confirmed everything in a way that could no longer be denied. And when Rebecca glanced at her again, that same careful observation hidden behind a polite smile, Chloe met her eyes calmly, and for the first time, there was something new in her gaze, something steady and knowing, because now she was not just reacting anymore, she was leading, and Rebecca did not even realize it yet. Rebecca noticed before the plates were even cleared, and Chloe could see it in the smallest shift of her expression, a flicker so brief that anyone else would have missed it, but Chloe was watching too closely now to overlook anything, and while Daniel continued talking about his day, unaware of the tension quietly tightening between the two women, Rebecca's attention lingered just a second too long on Chloe, as if she was waiting for something that never came, and that absence, that missing reaction, began to settle into the space between them like an unspoken question, and Chloe kept her movement steady, finishing her meal at a normal pace, even reaching for a glass of water with a calm hand, because this was part of the plan, to show nothing unusual, to give Rebecca no reason to suspect that anything had changed. And yet the longer the evening went on, the more Chloe could feel the shift, not in words, not in anything obvious, but in the silence, in the way Rebecca's smile did not quite reach her eyes anymore, in the way she stayed in the kitchen a little longer after dinner, as if replaying something in her mind, trying to understand what did not match her expectations. And Chloe did not push, did not confront, because she knew that pressure would only make Rebecca retreat, and what Chloe needed now was not distance, but clarity. And later that night, as the house settled into quiet again, Chloe remained in the living room, pretending to watch television while listening carefully to the faint sounds from the kitchen, and eventually she heard it, the soft movement of a cabinet opening, the slight clink of something being handled with care, and without rushing, without making a sound, Chloe stood and moved just enough to see into the hallway, her eyes fixed on the shadowed outline of Rebecca standing alone in the dim light, holding the small container, her posture still, almost thoughtful. And in that moment, Chloe realized something even more unsettling than before, because Rebecca was not reacting with panic or confusion, she was analyzing, adjusting, as if she already knew something had gone wrong and was preparing her next step. And Chloe felt a quiet chill settle in her chest, not from fear, but from understanding, because this was not over, not even close, and whatever Rebecca had planned, it was about to change. The next day, Rebecca did not wait for dinner to test whatever adjustment she had made, and Chloe noticed the shift immediately, because instead of her usual calm routine, Rebecca was more attentive, more present in a way that felt deliberate, asking Chloe what she wanted for lunch, offering to make something fresh, something special, and Daniel smiled at the gesture, commenting on how thoughtful Rebecca always was, while Chloe felt that same quiet tension settle beneath the surface, because this was new, this was not part of the usual pattern, and that meant Rebecca was no longer following the old one. And as Chloe sat at the kitchen island, watching Rebecca move with that same controlled precision, she understood that the balance between them had changed, that both of them were now aware, even if nothing had been spoken out loud. And when Rebecca placed the plate in front of her, her expression soft, her voice gentle as she asked Chloe to try it while it was still warm, Chloe met her gaze without hesitation, because this time she was ready for whatever came next, and she took a bite, slow and deliberate, keeping her attention sharp, not just on the taste, but on Rebecca, on the way her eyes stayed fixed for just a second longer than necessary. And then Chloe did something she had not done before. She set her fork down and smiled, a calm, steady smile that did not carry doubt or hesitation. And she said it tasted perfect, and for the first time, Rebecca did not respond. Immediately, her expression pausing, her eyes narrowing just slightly as if trying to read something she could not quite reach, and in that brief silence, Chloe felt a quiet certainty settle in, because whatever Rebecca had been expecting, it was not this, and that meant the situation was no longer under her control, not in the way she believed, and as Daniel continued talking, completely unaware of the silent exchange unfolding between them, Chloe leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her voice casual as she mentioned that she had been thinking about staying in town longer, maybe even making some permanent decisions about her future, and Rebecca's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker of something sharper behind her composed smile, and that was when Chloe understood the final piece, because this had never just been about discomfort or inconvenience, it had been about pushing her out, slowly, quietly, without leaving anything that could be traced back, and now that it was not working, Rebecca would have to change her approach, and Chloe knew that whatever came next would not be subtle anymore, because as Rebecca finally spoke again, her tone still soft, but carrying something colder beneath it, she said that sometimes staying too long in one place could create problems no one expected, and Chloe held her gaze without looking away, because now the truth was clear, and the only thing left was how far Rebecca was willing to go to protect whatever she was hiding.